I keep a log, always have 22 years in the field. Every animal I see, every treatment I give, every outcome. The registry supplies the forms, pre-printed columns with slots for species, age, weight, condition score, prognosis. The forms are designed for livestock. Cattle, draft animals, the occasional working beast brought in from the outer farms. Nobody designed a form for a dragon. I used one anyway, crossed out Livestock ID at the top with a pen and wrote patient. Left everything else as it was. Dreth Colony is not a place people come to on purpose. It sits at the far rim of the Karath frontier, a dry world with 2 rainy seasons and a wind that never fully stops. The colony itself is 3,000 people, mostly agricultural, the kind of settlement that exists because some planner 70 years ago put a pin in a map and said the soil looked workable. It is workable, just barely. The settlement runs on stubbornness more than anything else, which is perhaps why I've lasted out here as long as I have. My station is on the eastern edge of the colony proper, past the last row of residential blocks, and up a long dirt track that floods in the rains and cracks into tiles in the dry. I have 2 examination rooms, a small surgery, a barn that doubles as a long-term care ward, and 12 quarantine pens along the south wall, built from corrugated steel panels that clatter when the wind picks up. I have one assistant, a young woman named Prith who has been threatening to leave for the city for the past 4 years and has not yet done it. I pay her decently, and she is better with frightened animals than anyone I've ever worked with, so I try not to mention the city if she doesn't. The albino arrived on a regional transport in the 3rd week of the dry season. I say arrived. That implies someone brought it intentionally. What actually happened is that the transport captain sent me a message at 6:30 in the morning that said, "Regional warden left something in hold 7, says it's your problem now." I was already up. I'm always already up at 6:30. I pulled on my boots and drove the truck down to the transport bay, and found a quarantine crate in hold 7 with a feeding tray full of untouched dried protein meal, 2 inches of old water in the bottom of the drinking pan, and a dragon about the size of a large dog curled in the far corner with its wings folded tight against its sides. I had seen dragons before, not often and never one this young, but often enough to know what I was looking at and to understand that a dragon in that condition was not something you approached without being careful. The crate had a warden's paperwork folded and slid into the slot on the front. I read it standing in the transport bay with the smell of engine exhaust and dry dust coming in through the hold doors. The warden's note was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said the animal was an albino of the Vareth breed. Sex undetermined pending recovery of sufficient body mass. Estimated age between 8 and 14 months. Found in an abandoned holding pen at the old Tethys outpost 40 kilometers north of the colony boundary. The second paragraph said the animal had been in the holding pen for an unknown period, was severely underweight, showed respiratory distress, was blind in the left eye following an untreated injury, and had been assessed by the regional registry as non-viable for recovery. The third paragraph said the warden was leaving the colony on the evening transport, and that the animal was being surrendered to the Frontier Veterinary Station, as there were no other facilities equipped for large draconids in the district. The non-viable assessment was checked off on a pre-printed box at the bottom of the page. Below it, someone had written by hand, "If it makes it a week, we'll be surprised." I folded the paper and put it in my breast pocket and opened the crate. The dragon didn't move when I opened the door. That was the first thing I noticed, and it was not a good sign. A healthy animal of that species and temperament would have backed into the corner, spread its wings as wide as the crate allowed, and made enough noise to get my full attention. This one kept its wings folded and lifted its head just enough to fix the one working eye on me. The right eye, pale gold and still clear despite everything else that was wrong, and then it put its head back down on the floor of the crate. It was white, Not the off-white or cream that you occasionally see in leucistic animals. This was a clean, stark white from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail, scales with no pigmentation at all, translucent at the thinner points along the wing membranes where the light came through them like paper held up to a lamp. The injury to the left eye had left a faint scar running from just below the eye socket along the jaw, old enough to be fully healed, whatever had caused it. The ribs showed through the scales when it breathed, and the breathing itself had the slow, shallow quality of an animal managing pain. I said quietly, "All right, I'm going to pick you up now. Don't take that personally." It did not take it personally. It was too tired to object. I carried it to the truck. It was lighter than it should have been by half, which told me as much as the warden's paperwork had. I put it on the passenger seat, which I would normally never do with a patient, but the truck bed was open to the wind, and the morning air had a bite to it that I didn't like given the respiratory situation. The dragon lay on the seat with its head resting on the door panel and that pale gold eye tracking me as I drove, steady and patient in a way that animals rarely manage when they're frightened. It wasn't calm, exactly. It was just very, very tired. I put it in pen 12, the largest of the quarantine pens, the one I kept at the highest ambient temperature because it had the best insulation and a working heating panel in the ceiling. Pen 12 was meant for large draconids, and I'd only used it twice before, both times for injured adults brought in from the farming districts, neither of them anywhere near as ill as this one. I lined the floor with clean straw and set a water bowl where the animal could reach it without moving far and filled it, then went to the supply room and started making decisions. The respiratory distress was the immediate priority. I had a broad-spectrum course of treatments in stock, formulated for draconids, which the registry required me to maintain even though most of the draconids in the district were healthy and unsupervised, and had no more need of a vet than the hills did. I started a course that morning, administered by inhalation, which the dragon tolerated with the same exhausted patience it had shown in the truck. I left a small heating lamp running close to the sleeping position, not so close as to become a hazard, close enough to give the animal a warm spot to choose. I put out fresh food, a proper mix this time, not the dried meal that had been sitting untouched in the transport crate, and went to my office to write up the intake form. I crossed out Livestock ID and wrote patient. In the prognosis field I wrote, guarded, treatable. Prith read the intake form over my shoulder and said, "The registry already called it." "The registry is welcome to come out here and do the rounds," I said. She didn't argue. She went to check on the other patients, and I went back to pen 12 to see whether the animal had touched the food. It hadn't, but it had moved to the warm spot under the lamp. That at least was something. The next 3 weeks were the slowest kind of work there is in veterinary medicine, which is to say the kind where you cannot rush anything, and where the difference between recovery and failure is almost entirely patience. I went to pen 12 twice a day, morning and evening. Morning. Check the respiratory rate, replace the water, put out fresh food, administer the course of treatment, spend 15 minutes sitting on the floor of the pen where the animal could see me without having to turn its head. Evening, same sequence, minus the treatment on alternating days, plus a general physical assessment and a note in the log. I sat on the floor of the pen because I had learned over 22 years that frightened animals recover better when they stop being frightened, and animals stop being frightened faster when they understand that the person coming into their space is not a threat. You cannot explain this to an animal. You can only demonstrate it repeatedly, without exception. So I sat on the floor of pen 12 every morning and every evening and read whatever I had brought to read, a technical journal or the colony bulletin, or occasionally a letter from my sister, who lives on the main continent and writes to me 3 times a year to ask when I'm coming back to civilization. I wrote back to tell her that dress suited me fine, which was the truth. I don't think she believed it. The dragon watched me from the warm spot under the lamp. On the fourth day, it moved to the water bowl on its own, which was the first independent movement I documented. On the seventh day it ate. Not much, and not the protein mix I'd put out, but a strip of dried salted protein that Prith had left near the bowl on a whim, apparently having decided that the fancy draconid mix wasn't appealing. I logged this as a significant development. I went to the supply room and found the rest of the strip and put it in pen 12 and said nothing about it to anyone because I didn't want to make it into more than it was. Some animals eat and then stop again. Some improvement is temporary. This one kept eating. By the end of the second week, the respiratory rate had improved enough that I stepped back the treatment to every other day. The ribs still showed, but the breathing was quieter, the labored quality mostly gone. The animal had started rising to its feet when I came in rather than keeping its head down, still not moving toward me, still watchful, but upright and tracking. The pale gold eye followed everything in the pen with a focus that struck me more than I expected. I had worked with draconids before, and they were, as a rule, alert animals. This one was something beyond alert. It watched with the quality of a creature that was thinking about what it was watching, which was either my imagination or something I didn't have a framework for yet. On the 15th day it came to me. I was sitting in my corner with the colony bulletin, not looking at the animal deliberately because I had learned that not looking was better than looking when an animal was deciding whether to approach. I heard it move, and then there was a white nose about 8 inches from my knee and a pale gold eye regarding me from very close range. The animal lowered its head until the snout rested on the floor between my boots and stayed there. I kept reading the bulletin. My hands did not shake, but it was close. I reached down very slowly and placed one hand on the top of its head, between the small horn nubs that were just beginning to come in. The scales there were warm from the heating lamp and smooth in the way that healthy draconid scales are smooth, and the animal did not move. It breathed in long, even pulls. After a while I said, "Getting better then." It didn't answer, but it didn't move away either. I put that in the log. Patient made first voluntary contact, day 15. Physical condition improving, appetite stable, respiratory function significantly improved, prognosis revised, cautiously optimistic. I did not put in the log that I'd sat there for 40 minutes after putting the bulletin down, not doing anything except watching the morning light come through the high windows of the pen and feeling the slow, steady warmth of the animals breathing against my leg. Some things are for the log and some things are not. The colony took no particular notice of what was happening in pen 12. I hadn't publicized the arrival because there was no reason to, and because, in a small settlement, interest from the community occasionally turns into interference from the community, and pen 12 was not a place I wanted interfered with. Prith knew and said little. The transport captain who had delivered the crate was long gone on his route. The regional warden who had left the paperwork was presumably somewhere else in the district, dealing with other problems. The registry followed up at the end of the third week with an automated query asking whether the non-viable animal had been euthanized or had expired on its own. I replied that neither had occurred and that the patient was under active treatment. The automated system sent back a form letter explaining that the registry's assessment of non-viability was based on standardized criteria, and that resources expended on non-viable animals were not eligible for reimbursement under the district veterinary program. I filed that letter in the drawer I keep for correspondence I am not going to respond to, and went to give the evening treatment. Somewhere in the third week, it started watching the door. I noticed this on a Tuesday when I arrived at the usual morning time and found the animal already facing the pen door with its head up, the gold eye on the latch. I had not been late. I had come at the same time I always came. But the animal had heard something, boot steps on the barn floor, the particular sound of my truck in the yard, something, and had oriented to the entry point before I arrived. I logged it as anticipatory behavior, possible habituation to caretaker presence, and gave it no more analytical weight than that at the time, though I thought about it while I was driving back up the dirt track. The thing is, in 22 years of veterinary work, I've had animals that became habituated to a caregiver's presence. Dogs mostly, and a few of the larger livestock animals with longer memories. What that habituation produces is something like an alert readiness when the familiar person is near. The ears come forward, the body orients. There is a quality of recognition. That is what I expected when I logged the behavior. What I got was slightly different. The animal was not simply alert when I entered. It watched me work. This is not the same thing. Watching me work has a specificity to it that simple alert readiness doesn't. The eye follows what my hands are doing, not just where I am in the space. By the end of the third week, I had the distinct and unreasonable impression that the animal was learning my routine in some detail. Not just recognizing my presence, but tracking the sequence of what I did. The water bowl first, then the food, then the treatment, then the 15 minutes of sitting. When I deviated from the sequence, a morning when I'd forgotten the spare feeding ladle and had to go back to the supply room after already starting the water, the eye followed the deviation and stayed on the supply room door until I came back through it. I said nothing about this in the log beyond, alert and responsive. Some observations are for the log, and some are for the long drive home at the end of the day when you can turn them over without committing to anything. By week 4, the animal had a name. I hadn't intended to name it. I generally try not to name patients, because naming creates attachment, and attachment complicates judgment, and compromised judgment is a liability in this work. But I needed something to call it in the log that was more specific than the albino. And one morning when the light came in at a particular angle through the high windows and hit the white scales at such a way that the whole animal seemed to hold its own light rather than just reflect borrowed light from outside, I wrote Solon in the log without quite deciding to. Solon, it means something like the bright one in one of the old Dreth colony dialects, though I didn't know that when I wrote it. I just wrote what seemed accurate. The registry sent a second automated query at the start of week 4, more pointed than the first. This one asked for a formal disposition record within 10 working days, or the matter would be escalated to the district assessment board. I wrote back a letter, not a form, that explained that the patient was under active treatment and improving, and that I would file a full case report when the treatment course was complete. The district assessment board could do as it liked with that information. I had 22 years of practice records and a professional registration that had never been challenged, and I was not about to be pressured into writing off a live and improving animal because an automated query had a 10-day window. I sent the letter and went back to the morning rounds. Prith read my draft before I sent it and said, "You could soften the last paragraph." I said, "Why?" She thought about it. "I don't know," she said. "You're right about all of it." I sent it as written. Solon was eating well by week 4. Not delicately and not slowly. The animal ate with the focused efficiency of something that had been hungry for a long time and intended not to be hungry anymore, which I respected. The weight was coming back in a way I could see and measure, the ribs no longer counting themselves through the scales, the neck thickening toward the proportions a draconid of that size and age ought to have. The blind eye had not recovered its vision, and I did not expect it to. The scar tissue was too old and too complete. But Solon had compensated for it in the way that animals with single-eye vision learn to compensate, turning the working side slightly toward whatever needed to be seen, tracking with a precision that suggested the brain had long since rerouted around the deficit. The wing membranes were my ongoing concern in that 4th week. Dragon wings at that age are still growing, and Solon's had developed a faint asymmetry that I suspected was the result of being in close confinement during a critical growth period. The abandoned pen at Tethai's probably too small to allow full extension. I started daily passive exercises, extending each wing gently to its full span, and holding it there for counted intervals, which Solon tolerated with what I had come to recognize as its characteristic patience. Still, watchful, making no objection, the gold eye on my face throughout. The asymmetry was not severe. With consistent work it might resolve. Even if it didn't, the effect on flight would be minimal once full adult weight was achieved. I had begun, by this point, to think about the longer term. Pen 12 was adequate for the immediate recovery period, but not suited to a growing draconid indefinitely. I had some land behind the station, fenced for the cattle cases I occasionally took in for long-term care, and the outer paddock could be adapted. I had been making notes on what materials I would need. I ordered the lumber on the last day of week 4. The supply depot in the colony center was accustomed to my orders being practical and modest, and the requisition for extended fencing and a weather shelter panel took the clerk by mild surprise. He asked if I was expanding for livestock. I said I was expanding for a convalescent large draconid. He said the depot didn't get many requests like that. I said I imagined not. He filled the order without further comment, and I drove back to the station and went a look at the outer paddock and started measuring. Prith helped with the measurements in the way that she helps with most things, which is by pointing out every practical difficulty before we have taken a single step, and then working harder than anyone else once we have decided to proceed. She measured the east fence line twice because her first figure struck her as wrong, which is a habit I have come to rely on. It had not been wrong. She measured it again anyway. Solon watched us from the yard gate while we measured, the gold eye tracking the measuring tape and the fence posts, and the chalk line Prith ran along the ground to mark the new boundary. When I came back to the gate to put the measuring tape away, the animal stood very close to the gate and looked at me, and then looked out at the marked ground, and then looked at me again. I said, "That's going to be yours." It didn't answer, but it watched the rest of the measuring with what I can only describe as an informed interest. I put the lumber order in the log as a station expense. The paddock adaptation was not covered by the district veterinary program budget, which only reimbursed treatments, not infrastructure, which I had known before I placed the order and which had not changed my decision. Some things you pay for yourself. This is the part I want to be clear about, because it matters. None of what I was doing had anything to do with the bloodline. I didn't know about the bloodline. I didn't know there was a bloodline. I was a vet on a frontier colony doing what vets on frontier colonies do, which is trying to keep alive the things that are brought to me. And the thing that had been brought to me needed a paddock adaptation and daily wing exercises and a heating lamp and somebody to sit on the floor of its pen twice a day. And that was what I was providing. The warden had called it non-viable. The registry had agreed. I had a different view based on different evidence, and the evidence kept getting more compelling every week. Week 5. I came in on a Thursday morning to find Solon standing at the pen gate. Standing, not resting. Upright on all 4 feet, head at the height of the gate latch, looking at the door of the barn with the kind of quality of attention that suggested it had been standing there a while. The food was gone from the bowl, all of it, which was the first time the morning portion had been finished before I arrived. I opened the gate. I had not planned to open the gate. I had not decided to. My hand went to the latch and the latch opened and I stepped back, and Solon came through the gate into the main corridor of the barn, as if it had been walking through gates its entire life. It was taller than I'd registered in the pen, because in the pen there was no exterior reference, and I had been sitting on the floor for most of our interactions. Standing in the corridor, Solon came up to my shoulder. The wings were folded, but you could see their full span potential in the way they sat along the back, the bones longer than they'd looked in the confined space of the quarantine pen. The white scales caught the barn light and held it, and the gold eye turned toward me with an expression I had no technical term for, and have not found one since. I took Solon on a walk around the barn. I'm not sure who was leading whom. We went past the examination rooms, past the supply room, along the outer wall where the other quarantine pens were, most of them empty. We stopped at pen 2 where I had a cow with a hoof injury, who regarded Solon with considerable alarm. Solon regarded the cow with what I can only describe as polite disinterest. We went to the back of the barn, and I opened the rear door into the yard, and Solon walked out into the morning. The wind was low that morning and the air had a clean smell that breath gets after a cool night, and the sky was going from pale gray to the dusty blue gold of full sunrise, and Solon stood in the yard with its head raised and spread its wings. Not fully. The asymmetry stopped it from going to full extension on the left side. But it went to perhaps 80% on both sides and held there, and the morning light went through the wing membranes in the way it had gone through them that first morning in the transport bay, backlit, translucent and white, and something that had been in that animal all through the weeks of the pen and the log entries and the twice-daily visits came through clearly for the first time. Whatever it was not diminished. It had been waiting. I gave it 5 minutes and then I said, "Come on then," and went back inside to start the morning rounds, and Solon folded its wings and followed me. Prith was at the supply room door when we came back through, and she looked at Solon and then at me and then at Solon again, and she said nothing at all, which is unlike her, and that is how I knew that she had been more worried about the outcome than she'd said. By the end of week 5, I had started work on the paddock adaptation. The work went slowly because I was doing it around the rest of the station's needs, and because Prith had opinions about the bracket spacing that she expressed at length, and that turned out, when I checked the load calculations, to be correct. Tor Veth was not yet with us in week 5. It was just the two of us and the hammer and the dry dreth wind rattling the corrugated panels on the south wall. Solon watched from wherever it happened to be in the yard. On most mornings it was at the far end doing the exercise, the slow fence walk at partial wing extension, and I could see the left side improving if I watched carefully, the membrane going a fraction further toward full span each session than it had gone the session before. The compensation the animal had developed for the blind left eye meant it sometimes listed slightly to the right when concentrating on something to its left, a small unconscious correction, and I had started the wing exercises from that side deliberately to give the weaker direction more attention. It worked the way most physical therapy works, which is slowly and then less slowly, and then one morning you measure, and the numbers have quietly become what you were hoping they would be. There were evenings in week 5 when I would finish the barn rounds and come out to the yard, and Solon would be sitting in the last of the sun with its wings at the resting partial extension, and its head turned slightly east toward whatever the wind was carrying off the dry flats, and I would sit on the yard bench for a while before driving back up the track, and neither of us said anything, and the wind did what the dreth wind does, and it was a perfectly sufficient way to end a working day. I put none of that in the log. The log is for clinical observations. The week before the scout arrived, I got a letter from my sister. This one asked whether I had met anyone. She asks this every third letter. I wrote back to say that I was treating a convalescent draconid of some interest and that the paddock adaptation was coming along well. She responded, by return transport, that this was not what she had meant. I did not write back to that one. The scout from the Vareth Pale Court arrived on a Tethys freight run in the 3rd week of Solon's 6th week with me. I did not know she was a scout. She came to the station in a rented field transport, a female draconid in a form I would describe as the draconic humanoid hybrid that some of the older bloodlines carry, tall and narrow-built with scaled forearms visible below her sleeves, and a ridge of small horns along the crown of her head. The scales there a deep violet gray. She introduced herself as Vera Anthos, Warden's Assessment, Karath Frontier District, which was a title I hadn't heard before and which should perhaps have told me something. She said she was conducting a routine survey of frontier veterinary stations, and could she see the facility. I showed her the facility. I have nothing to hide in the facility and no reason to be uncooperative with a warden's assessment. I showed her the examination rooms, the surgery, the supply room, the barn with the current patients, and the quarantine pens. Solon was in the yard by this point, which I'd begun leaving open to it during the day, and Vera Anthos went still in the way that a person goes still when they see something they have been looking for and are not fully prepared to have found. She stood at the yard door for a long moment. Solon was at the far end of the yard, doing the daily wing exercise I'd developed, which involved walking the full length of the fence at a pace that required the wings to stay at partial extension for balance. It was a technique I'd read about in a paper on avian rehabilitation and adapted, and it was working, the asymmetry measurably better over the previous 2 weeks. Solon was concentrating on the exercise with the same focused attention it gave everything, the gold eye steady, the white scales in the mid-morning sun, a color that was not quite white but not quite anything else either. Vera Anthos said, very quietly, "How long has this animal been in your care?" 6 weeks and 2 days, I said. She said, "And before that?" "Found in an abandoned pen at the Tethys outpost. I don't know how long it was there before the warden picked it up. The paperwork didn't specify." "No," she said, "it wouldn't." I looked at her. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" She turned from the yard door, and her expression was the expression of someone making a decision about how much to say. She was a careful person, I thought. Deliberate. Not evasive, exactly, but aware of the weight of her words in a way that suggested she'd had cause to be careful before. She said, "The animal in your yard, the coloration." "Albinism. I've documented it thoroughly." "It isn't albinism," she said. I let that sit for a moment. I said, "I'm listening." What she told me in the next 20 minutes I will try to summarize as accurately as I can, though I want to be honest that I understood perhaps half of it clearly, and the rest I have pieced together from subsequent conversations. The Varath Pale Court is an old institution, older than the Karath frontier settlement by centuries, a governing bloodline among the Draconid peoples of the outer systems who rule, for want of a better word, by a combination of hereditary authority and consensus among the major Draconid territories. The court is pale, historically, or rather the court was. The pale designation refers to the colorlessness that the oldest Varath bloodline carries, a genetic marker that has become increasingly rare over generations of mixed bloodline succession. Not albinism, though it presents similarly, a specific inherited trait that carries certain physiological markers, among them the pale gold of the eye, the translucence of the wing membranes, and the particular quality of the scale coloration that is not absence of pigment, but something closer to its opposite, a reflective property that intensifies rather than diminishes in natural light. The Varath Pale Court had been in a succession crisis for 11 years. The previous heir had died or been lost. Vera Anthos was careful about the distinction and I didn't press it. A search had been ongoing. Pale trait draconids were tracked from the outer territories and assessed, none with the full marker set, until a report had come through the freight registry 6 weeks ago about an albino draconid surrendered to a frontier vet station on Dreth Colony. Condition poor, registry assessment non-viable, and something in the description had matched enough that Vera Anthos had been sent to confirm. She was looking at me when she finished. I said, "You're telling me that animal is the heir to the Pale Court." She said, "I'm telling you the markers are present. Confirmation requires the full bloodline assessment, which I'm not qualified to conduct. I'm telling you that the court has been looking for 11 years, and that what is in your yard is the closest match we have found." I thought about this. I thought about the abandoned pen at the Tethys outpost, the untouched dried meal in the transport crate, the animal that had been too tired to object when I picked it up. I thought about the warden's form with the non-viable box checked and the handwritten note at the bottom that said, "If it makes it a week, we'll be surprised." I said, "When will the rest of the court arrive?" She looked slightly taken aback by that. She said, "I need to file my report first. The court would then." "How long?" She calculated, 2 weeks, perhaps 3. "There are protocols." "Then we have 2 weeks," I said, "to finish the wing exercise course and get the left side extension to where it needs to be. Come and see the paddock adaptation." She came and saw the paddock adaptation. I showed her what I'd built and what I still needed to build, and she asked careful, intelligent questions about the exercise regimen and the respiratory history and the dietary record, and I answered them. And by the end of the tour, she had stopped being careful and diplomatic and was just asking me questions because she wanted to know the answers. She had, I suspected, a background in animal husbandry that she was not advertising. I asked her about it, and she said, somewhat dryly, that her formal training was in assessment and protocol, but that she had grown up on a breeding ranch in the Voreth territories and had learned what she'd learned there. I said that was useful, and she agreed that it was. She stayed 4 days. She filed her report, she told me, from her transport on the evening of the first day, and then she was simply at the station for the remaining 3, helping with the wing exercises, asking questions, and watching Solon with an expression I am not going to try to describe in detail, because it is the kind of expression that belongs to a person and not to a report. On the last morning before she left, Solon approached her. I was in the corridor and I heard the gate and turned around, and Solon had crossed the yard to where Vera Anthos was standing at the fence and had put its head over the fence rail and was regarding her from about a foot away, the gold eye steady. Vera Anthos had gone perfectly still, not from fear, I thought, but from the opposite of fear, and she raised one hand very slowly and placed it on the white scales between the horn nubs, in the same spot I had touched on the 15th morning. She stood there for a while. She was not crying, but it was close. She left on the afternoon transport. Before she went, she said that the court party would arrive within 3 weeks and that she would be with them. She said they would bring a formal delegation and that I should perhaps prepare for a larger number of visitors than I was accustomed to. I said I would put on extra coffee, and she gave me a look I couldn't quite read and got into the transport. I went back to the afternoon rounds. The 2 weeks between Vera Anthos's departure and the delegation's arrival were among the quieter weeks I have had at the station in recent memory, which I say knowing that quiet weeks on Dreth are not the same as uneventful ones. The cow in pen 2 was progressing well. The rabbit in pen 7 had cleared its infection and gone home. A border collie came in with a lacerated pad, was stitched up, and went home the following day. A pair of working draft animals from the eastern farms came in for their annual wellness checks, both in good condition, both displeased about the experience. Prith handled their discharge paperwork and I did the driving. Solon moved into the expanded paddock during the first week of that interval. The transition took about 4 minutes. I opened the paddock gate, stepped back, and Solon walked through it and went to the far corner and stood in the sun. Then it walked the perimeter, all 4 sides at a measured pace, head down at certain intervals as if checking the ground, the gold eye taking in everything. It took perhaps 20 minutes to complete the circuit. Then it came back and stood near the gate and looked at me, and I interpreted this as a satisfactory report and closed the gate. The wing extension improved steadily over those 2 weeks. I kept the daily exercise going, the fence walk, and added a new component in the 2nd week, a short open-air trot across the paddock in which I asked for a brief wing-assisted hop at the far end, just enough to get the wings out to full extension for one committed moment. The first few attempts were tentative and slightly crooked, the left side pulling in a fraction early. By the 5th session it was clean, the left membrane matching the right through the full arc. I logged it as full bilateral extension achieved, no observed asymmetry. Prognosis, excellent. I underline things in the log when they matter. I underlined that one. I thought in those 2 weeks about what was coming. I am not a person who prepares for things he cannot prepare for, so mostly I did the rounds and wrote the log and worked on the paddock gate latch, which had developed a stiffness that I'd been meaning to address for a month. I thought about what Vera Anthos had said about 11 years, about the heir that had been lost or gone, about the abandoned pen at Tethys and the untouched dried meal, and the animal that had been too tired to object when I lifted it into the truck. I thought about the way Dreth sits at the far rim of everything, past the last reliable freight route and the last reliable communication relay, the kind of place that drops things and doesn't notice, and how that is sometimes a disadvantage and sometimes, apparently, not. I did not discuss any of this with Prith. She knew, roughly, what was coming because I had told her a formal delegation would be arriving and that it was connected to the patient in the paddock, and that she should feel free to take the day off if she preferred not to be present. She had given me a look that suggested she found this suggestion offensive and returned to the supply inventory without another word. I took that as a no. I oiled the paddock gate latch on the morning of the 16th day. It worked smoothly after that. The court arrived on the 17th day. I want to try to describe this accurately, because I find I distrust my own memory of it when I don't try to anchor it to specific detail, and I am not a person who distrusts his own memory as a general rule. I keep good notes. I pay attention. There were 11 of them in the delegation proper, plus Vera Anthos, who came off the transport first and gave me a look that I read as an apology and a warning simultaneously, and that I didn't fully understand until the transport finished unloading. The 11 were all draconid, draconic humanoid hybrids in the same way that Vera Anthos was, but more formally marked, scales more elaborate in their patterning, the coloring deeper and more varied, ranging from deep blue-violet to the bronze gold of one elder who was clearly the senior member of the party. 2 of them were very large, not quite the size of a ground transport but close to it, and I was briefly grateful that I had expanded the outer paddock. The elder, whose name I was given as Mathos Kethvara, the Lord Arbiter of the Pale Court, approached me with the deliberate and unhurried quality of a person who has not been unhurried in quite a while, but is choosing to be now. He was old, I thought, in the way that draconids are old when they are very old, which is to say that the age is not in diminishment but in density, as if each year has added something rather than taken it away. He was taller than any of the others, and the bronze gold of his scales was not the simple color I'd thought from a distance but layered, shifting slightly in the light, and his eyes were amber, not pale gold. He inclined his head to me by about 15 degrees, which I was told later was a substantial thing. He said in accented but clear standard, "You are the veterinarian." I said I was. He said, "You kept the white one." I said that I had treated an animal that was presented to me as non-viable, that the assessment had proved incorrect, and that the patient was currently doing well. I said it the way I say most things, which is plainly, because I don't have a more elaborate register for extraordinary moments, and I am not sure I would use one if I did. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "The registry said it would not survive." "The registry," I said, "is welcome to come out here and do the rounds." It was the same thing I'd said to Prith 6 weeks earlier, and it came out the same way it had come out then, which was without particular emphasis, just a statement of where I stood. Several members of the delegation exchanged looks. Vera Anthos was very carefully not looking at any of them. Mathos Kethvara said, "We would like to see the patient." I took them to the yard. This is the part I find hardest to write accurately, because the things that happened in the yard that morning are not the kind of things my log was designed to record, and I am aware that my account of them will sound different from how they felt, and they felt very large, but I'll try. Solon was in the far end of the yard in the sun, not exercising, just standing in the sun with the wings at partial extension, which I had come to think of as its resting posture on clear mornings, soaking the warmth into the membranes. The white of it in that light was the particular white I had first seen in the transport bay, and had tried to describe accurately in the log, and had always fallen short of describing, because it was not just whiteness but something about how the light moved in it, or moved with it, or came from it. And I had stopped trying to find the right word for it weeks ago and simply written characteristic coloration in the log because that was as close as the vocabulary I had available would take me. The delegation went still at the yard door. Not uniformly. Some of them stilled completely, as if something had happened to time in the vicinity. The two large ones, who had been flanking Mathos Kethvara at a slight remove, lowered their heads in a motion that was slow and deliberate and didn't look like anything I had seen before, and that I later understood was a formal bow of the deepest register. Several others followed. Vera Anthos, beside me, made a very small sound that I don't think was intended to be heard. Solon turned toward them. The gold eye went across the whole of the delegation slowly, taking its time, the same focused attention I had watched through 6 weeks of recovery, the quality of watching that had always seemed to me to be more than simple animal awareness. It looked at each of them for a moment, the same brief, steady regard, and then it crossed the yard to where I was standing at the door. It put its head against my shoulder. The scales were warm from the sun, and I could feel the slow steadiness of its breathing. Mathos Kethvara watched this. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I stopped expecting him to speak and just stood there with the weight of Solon's head on my shoulder and the mourning going on around us. Eventually he said, "When we lost the heir, there was a belief in the court that it was an ending, that the line had run out, that what was old in us was finished." I waited. He said, "We have been searching for 11 years. We found it in your yard." I said, "You found it in an abandoned pen at the Tethys outpost." "I just helped it recover." He said, "Yes," and then after a moment, "And we did not." That was the part that sat with me afterward, the part I kept returning to in the days that followed when I was doing the rounds or writing up the log or driving the truck back down the dirt track from the transport bay after some delivery or another. We did not. An empire with resources and reach and formal delegations, and a Lord Arbiter with the weight of centuries behind him. And the thing they'd been searching for 11 years had been in an abandoned pen for an unknown period. And the warden had left it with me with a form that had the non-viable box checked. And I had crossed out Livestock ID and written patient, and gone to sit on the floor of the pen twice a day. I don't say this with pride. I say it as a straightforward account of what happened. I am a veterinarian. I treat the animals that are brought to me. I don't have a framework for what I should have done differently with Solon, and I didn't have one when the delegation arrived, and I don't have one now. The animal was sick, and I had the means to help, and so I helped. That's the whole of it as far as I can work out. After Mathos Kethvara had finished looking at Solon in the yard, he asked to speak with me inside. We went to the office, which is a small room with a desk and 2 chairs and a wall of filing drawers and a window that looks out onto the dirt track, and I pulled the extra chair from the corner and made tea, because I make tea when I don't know what else to do, and we sat down. He said that the court wished to express its gratitude formally and at length and through appropriate channels, and that what was appropriate in this situation was somewhat without precedent, the situation being without precedent. He said the court would like to offer me a title, which he described in terms I partly understood, something in the nature of a keeper designation, a formal recognition by the court. He said the court would also like to offer a recompense for the treatment costs, which the registry had declined to cover, and which I had presumably absorbed from the station budget. I said that was kind. He said that there was also the matter of an ongoing role, if I were willing to consider it, something to do with the heir's care and the care of the bloodline more generally, which would involve occasional travel and a substantial change to the nature of my work. I said I appreciated the offer. He waited. I said, I have 12 quarantine pens, 3 of which are occupied at the moment, including a cow with a hoof injury in pen 2 who needs her dressing changed this afternoon. I have a rabbit with a respiratory infection in pen 7 that I've been watching since Tuesday and that I'm cautiously optimistic about, though I want to see another 2 days of data before I commit to that in the log. And I have an outer paddock that I need to finish adapting, because the patient you've come to see has been in a standard-sized pen for 6 weeks and needs more space for the next phase of the exercise program. He was quiet. I said, "I'm not declining anything. I'm telling you where I am." He looked at me with the amber eyes and the layered bronze gold of the scales and the weight of 11 years of searching in his face, and he said, "You are a particular kind of person." I said, "I'm a frontier vet." He said, "Yes." We drank the tea. He asked me questions about the treatment course, good questions, the questions of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to know. I answered them. Vera Anthos had joined us at some point, sitting in the doorway with her arms on her knees, and she asked her own questions when his were done, the more technical ones, the hoof-level questions rather than the policy-level ones. I liked her for that. After a while Mathos Kethvara said, "The title, at minimum. The court will not leave without conferring it. It is how we mark the thing that happened here." I said I didn't have a strong opinion about titles. He said, "Keth Salin. It means roughly the one who kept the white one's fire." He paused. "It is not a name for a ceremony. It is a name for a record, so that whoever asks in whatever court or territory can know what was done here and by whom." I thought about the log I'd kept. Every treatment, every outcome, every morning visit. Patient, guarded, treatable, cautiously optimistic. I thought about the warden's form with the non-viable box checked and the note at the bottom, and the way I'd filed it in the drawer I keep for letters I am not going to respond to. I said, "Put it in the record then." He put it in the record. There was a brief ceremony, which I will not describe in detail because the details belong to the court and not to me. Vera Anthos stood as a witness. The 2 large members of the delegation were in the yard for it, which meant Solon was in the yard for it, which I had not planned but which seemed right. The delegation left the following morning. Not all of them. Vera Anthos was staying for another week to observe the exercise program and compile her full assessment. One of the younger court members was staying as well, a compact draconid with deep green scales who was apparently assigned some kind of formal role as the heir's companion, though Solon regarded this arrangement with polite tolerance more than enthusiasm, which I thought was sensible given the degree of solitude it had adapted to. The companion's name was Torveth, and within 2 days Torveth was following Prith around the barn like a useful shadow, which worked out well for everyone. Mathos Kethvara said goodbye in the yard with the morning light coming in from the east, and he inclined his head again, the same 15 degrees, and I shook his hand, which was not the gesture he had been expecting but which he received without missing a step, and he got into the transport. I went to change the dressing on the cow in pen 2. The hoof was looking better. Another week and I thought we would be past the risk window. I logged it as improving, continued monitoring indicated, and moved on to pen 7, where the rabbit was eating with a good appetite, which was a pleasing development, and I updated the prognosis from cautiously optimistic to optimistic, pending 1 more day of observed feeding. Prith was in the supply room when I came through, counting the inventory list with Torveth reading off the items, and she said without looking up, "You know you're in the Pale Court records now." "So I'm told," I said. "You're not going to do anything about that." "I'm going to finish the paddock adaptation this afternoon." She looked up at that. "The lumber order came in while you were with the Lord Arbiter." "Good," I said, "let's go." She put down the inventory list. Torveth put down the clipboard. We all went out to the paddock. Solon was in the morning sun at the far end of the yard with the wings at partial extension, soaking the warmth in through the membranes. The white of it caught the light and held it the way it always did, the particular quality I'd been writing characteristic coloration in the log for, and hadn't found a better phrase for yet. I picked up a board and got to work. The morning went on, and the wind was low, and the only sounds were the hammer and the lumber and prith complaining about the angle of a bracket. And somewhere in the east the freight transports were running their routes, and the pale court was heading back toward the outer territories with whatever it needed to head back with. And in pen 2 the cow's hoof was healing, and in pen 7 the rabbit was eating. And across the yard, the heir of the pale throne was standing in the dreth morning sun, learning what warmth felt like when you had enough of it. I squared the bracket and drove the nail, and moved to the next board. Some things are for the record, some things are just the work.